Welcome back to another exciting adventure of For the Glory of God and Kings. I am your host, Travis Finley, and we are reading the Bible for the first time again. We're continuing in our study of Genesis in the early chapters, and I want to go back and reiterate two of the points that I made in the last two episodes. The first one being the Hebrew term for God, which is, as we saw, the plural Elohim. The singular for God is El, or Eloah, and then the plural is Elohim. And I tried to show you from Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32 briefly that the term Elohim in the very same sentence refers both to God in the singular and then also a plurality of gods. And so I wanted to reiterate the fact that what I was trying to communicate to you was that within the supernatural realm, there is a supra-human class of beings that are created by God, to which also God belongs because he's superhuman and he belongs in that supernatural class, except that that one true God, Elohim, or Yahweh, as we see in chapter 2, is the supreme ruler over all of the other Elohim. He is the creator of all things. No one surpasses him. There is no one like him. And the rest of the scriptures are replete with that contrast of the other Elohim as not being compared to the one true God. And so I just wanted to reiterate that fact because it's a pretty deep concept if you haven't thought about it before, if you've never come across the divine council ideas. Those are an option for you to look up online, and particularly with Michael Heiser as a very reliable source in understanding that important biblical focus. And then in Genesis chapter 2, we talked about the importance of translation when we get into the creation of man and the creation of the animal kingdom. And I pointed out the fact that a lot of people think the difference between animals and men are that animals were not given the spirit of life. And so when we saw in Genesis 2, when God formed man out of the dust of the ground, he spirited into his face the spirit of life, or he breathed into his face the breath of life, or he winded into his face the wind of life. And I made the point that I think that it's probably best, even in the English, to simply transliterate the Hebrew, ruach, into the English, so that the decision for the interpretation is left to us, how we're going to understand the context, if it's spirit, wind, or breath. But then I went on to challenge you to think about the symbolic nature of the animal kingdom in Genesis chapter 2, and then also later on in Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9, when we have the flood. And in the flood account, we are told that everything that died in the flood had the spirit of life in it. And the things that had the spirit of life in them were the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, and the sea creatures. Okay? Now, what that tells us is either the animal kingdom is just like humanity because they have the spirit of life, or the animal kingdom is symbolic of humanity, and it is actually humanity that alone has the spirit of life breathed into its face. And so while I don't give you all of the answers or try to come down hard and fast on a lot of these topics, I'm trying to throw out some stuff for you to think about and hopefully grow from. So we're going to keep going in Genesis chapter 2. And we are going to think about the reality that theology is a part of our interpretation no matter where we begin in the Bible. As I've thought about these lessons, I've struggled with where should I begin, because I think I said at one point that the Bible is like a story. If you think about the middle part as the turning point and the edges as the beginning and the end, that I would put the prophets as that turning point and to focus on them and their language, because what happens in the prophets, I believe, shines light back on what we need to understand about the beginning of the Bible and then also how we understand the end. But you can't have everything because nobody reads the Bible the same. But I want to encourage you to think holistically and to read in a broad spectrum so that you can take what you learn in one spot and bring it here and compare and contrast and try to figure things out. Okay? But what we're going to look at right here in the creation of Adam is his placement in the Garden of Eden and try to unpack that a little bit, okay? Out of the ground, Yahweh God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. All right, now we need to stop there because here we have a development. Remember, I told you that if we took a literal reading of Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, they were going to conflict. Here is an aspect in which that's true. We are just told that that God created every tree pleasing to the sight and good for food. So when we read that, what does that make us think about that includes every tree that's pleasing to the sight and good for food? Okay. Take that back to day 3, where we learn that the only things that God created on day 3 were the grain plants and the fruit trees. Okay, the grain plants and the fruit trees. And here we are told that God creates every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food. That's going to come up later on when we see the temptation with Eve. So put that in the back of your mind and save that for the next time. The tree of life was also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now, a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden. Remember, we talked about the garden of God being on a mountain. Water flows down. So we're in a garden sanctuary, a garden temple. And with that idea, we go in to see what Adam's responsibilities are. So Yahweh God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to serve and guard it. Remember, we talked about the importance of translation here as well. These two words, serve and guard, are the same two words that refer to the priest's duty in the tabernacle. And we looked at a chapter in Numbers, and then also you can refer back to Exodus when you look at the tabernacle and its creation there. Okay, so the point that I want to make is that we have to read between the lines. We have to squint and pay attention to the details because we're getting a rich theology of who Adam is in the garden. He is a priest. He is serving in God's arboreal temple, and he has the responsibility of guarding it. So Yahweh God commanded the man, saying, "From any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it you will surely die." So God gives Adam a prohibition. Reading between the lines, understanding that this is a tabernacle picture, a temple sanctuary picture, where we have a priest, guess what we have? We have a rule. We have a law. We have a food prohibition. Now, if we are familiar with Israel's story as a nation of priests who have 613 rules for them as priests, priests in the Bible are given rules. Do this, do this, do this. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's very specific. This is another clue in the text, I believe, should help us to see more of what's going on here. Adam is given a prohibition that's a food prohibition that is a small picture of what happens to Israel later on when they are given more prohibitions, but it's the same idea. God gives you a rule, and the consequences of that disobedience is death. Now, in the next episode, we're going to think about and talk a little bit about what that death is supposed to be. So, as we continue to look through the book of Genesis, I want to encourage you to subscribe to this channel and make comments along the way and interact so we can grow together. And we'll see you next time on For the Glory of God and Kings, reading the Bible for the first time again.